Hi everybody and welcome to your first microbiology video. My name is Miss Calabrese. I'm going to be your instructor for the term. Um, this first video we're going to talk a little bit about taxonomy and then we'll get into an introduction to microbes. All right, so taxonomy itself is just the science of classifying organisms. So putting different organisms into different categories based on how closely they are related to one another by sharing similar features or sharing similar genetics. And we organize these things, it's easy to organize these things because we give each living organism its own unique name so that it doesn't share a name with anything else on the planet. And that binomial name or two-word name um, is usually in Latin. And it's the genus and species name of that particular organism. So every organism on the planet has a very specific species name in its own genus, or in a genus that it might share with some others. And that lets us narrow down so that we know we're talking about the same organism. So for example, the one on this slide here is Escherichia coli. I'll highlight that there. So Escherichia coli is a type of bacteria. In this case, Escherichia is the genus name. Note here that the genus name is always capitalized. Coli is the species name. Species name is always lowercase. So your genus name should always be capitalized. Your species name should always be lowercase. And when we write these scientific names, if we're handwriting this out on a piece of paper, we would underline it. And if we're typing this in a computer, then we would italicize it. So that's just a common sort of technique when you're writing something in another language, and this is another language, is Latin. All right, so let's get into details on what some of these classifications look like. All right, so we classify going from large groups to small groups. So here's a list of all of these major classifications on Earth. So the largest one is going to be the one at the top here. So domain is the largest category we have. And in fact, there are only 3 domains. And those 3 domains, those 3 categories, hold all of life on Earth, can fit into one of those 3 domains. Then if we choose one of those domains and we go further down the scale here and we get to kingdom, there are kingdoms within domains. Then there are phylums within kingdoms, classes within phylums, orders within classes, and so on all the way down the list here. So as we move downward like this, we're getting into smaller and smaller groups where there are millions of organisms in a domain. There will only be one organism that has the particular genus and species name any particular critter has. So common question at this point is, do I have to know all of these classifications? And the answer is yes, you do. But here's a handy mnemonic device that I always use to help me remember them. So, dear King Philip came over for good spaghetti. And if you just look at the first letters of each one of those words in that sentence, it gives you the first letters of each one of the words that are our taxonomic categories here. All right, so and these categories are important to help us keep organized our thoughts about different organisms and how they relate to one another. So for example, you as a human, you're in the genus Homo, species Sapiens, and then we can go on up here higher and higher in this classification and say that you're in the family Hominidae and you're in the order Primates and the class Mammalia and the phylum Chordata. So we can just keep going up and up, the kingdom Animalia and the domain Eukarya. So we can keep going up and up in these classifications to help us realize how closely we're related to other critters, whether we share a common ancestor, maybe back at the order level or at the class level or at the phylum level, lets us know how long ago we shared common ancestry. All right. All right, so ever since the origins of the study of biology, scientists have been trying to classify different organisms. So way back to Darwin and Haeckel, there was an idea of just maybe 2 kingdoms, right? Just there's plants and then there's animals, and that's all you have. Obviously, that wasn't correct, but it was the best kind of idea we had at the time. Haeckel later added in the protists as another kingdom. So at that point, there were three kingdoms. And then later on added in the Monera. Monera it's no longer a kingdom, but it used to be the catch-all category for anything that was like bacteria. Um, then the more recent kind of arrangement of this was this five kingdom structure. And this five kingdom structure, this was the way it was taught to me when I was in school, that you have five kingdoms: the animals, the plants, protists, Monera, and fungi. Right, so now we're throwing in fungi there, realizing that those fungi are not the same as plants, very different from plants, so they deserve their own kingdom. Right, so this was a pretty common way of looking at the classification of life on Earth until pretty recently. Right, so what happened recently is that we got DNA evidence. We got pretty good at doing genetics such that we could take evidence from DNA and proteins from different organisms and actually see how closely related these things are. So once we started looking at actual DNA and protein evidence, um, the categories started to look a little bit different than we thought. So prior to this, we were just looking at, morphological similarities, how things looked closely to one another. Now we have actual evidence with the genes, how close those genes look to one another. So these guys, Woese Fox, came up with this system using genetic evidence, and that puts us into three domains of life. Right, so our three domains are bacteria, Archaea, and Eukarya. Right, so those are our three domains of life. Now we still have kingdoms, but kingdoms are now going to be nested under domains. So here are our kingdoms, which are now smaller categories underneath the domain Eukarya, which is all the eukaryotic cells. All right, here's another way of representing that tree of life, just so we can see those three major domains again. So towards the left side of your screen, you can see the bacteria and the archaea right in the middle. And on the right side of your screen is the domain Eukarya. And that domain Eukarya is where you would find all animals, plants, fungi, any multicellular life is going to be over in that domain Eukarya. All prokaryotic cells, simple single-celled organisms, are either going to be in the domain bacteria or archaea. Okay, so quick question here. Which of the following are domains of the Woese Fox system of taxonomy? Think about it for a second. All right, and there's your answer. So those middle three there, the eukarya, the archaea, and the bacteria are all domains within the Woese Fox system. All right, let's talk a little bit about microbes in general and give you some idea of what constitutes a microbe and what does not. All right, so microbes generally include anything that's going to be too small to be seen with your naked eye. If we need a microscope to be able to see it, it's probably a microbe. Common categories of microorganisms are bacteria, algae, protozoa, helminths, viruses. These things are all microorganisms, meaning they're too small to be seen without a microscope. All right, so we're going to start by talking about bacteria. So bacteria are prokaryotic microorganisms. So that means they've got a very particular cell structure that's different from other cell structures. So bacteria are, we find bacteria all over the world. Most of them are harmless. So most bacteria actually don't hurt you. And in fact, a lot of them are actually helpful to your health. But a few do cause disease. If they cause disease, then we refer to them as pathogens. Now, because they are prokaryotic cells, they have no nucleus inside. And these guys also have a cell wall on the outside of their cells. That cell wall is made of a substance called peptidoglycan. So remember that word, peptidoglycan. It's a chemical that creates the outer wall of a bacterial cell. All right, our next group here is Archaea. These are also prokaryotic microorganisms. Archaea look a whole lot like bacteria, right? So they look very similar. They're small prokaryotic single cells with no nucleus. So in that way, they resemble bacteria a lot. Turns out, though, that these guys are mostly environmental critters, which means that we don't find them causing disease. They're not infectious. You usually just find them in the environment, and a lot of times you find them in really strange environments. So halophiles are things that like really salty environments. Thermophiles are critters that like really hot environments. So these are common places where you would find archaeas, like um, in ice sheets in the Antarctic, or in deep sea thermal vents, or in the Great Salt Lake, places that are pretty unusual to find life in. The life that's there is most likely Archaea. Now, these guys differ from bacteria in their cell walls in that bacterial cell walls contained peptidoglycan. Archaea contains pseudopeptidoglycan. So pseudo means false here. So that means these guys have a false peptidoglycan cell wall. All right, moving on to the protozoa. So protozoa are going to be a lot larger than bacteria or archaea. They are eukaryotic microorganisms, so their cells are of the eukaryotic structure. Protozoa specifically are animal-like protists. So if we're looking at the kingdoms within the domain Eukarya, they belong in the Protista, but they're animal-like in some of their structures because many of them can move around, and that makes them resemble animals. All right, so they're all single-celled. Again, most of these are harmless, just like most bacteria are harmless. They just live in the water, in the soil. If you grab a microscope and look at any puddle, you'll find tiny little protozoa in there. There are a few that are pathogenic, so there are a few protozoa that we consider parasitic, and we'll talk about those as we go further in the term here. The protozoa that move around are going to be moving with structures like flagella, cilia, or pseudopodia. Pseudopodia means a false feet, meaning they can kind of stick out a little projection of their cell and use it as a foot to move around. Um, as far as some examples of pathogenic protozoa, malaria is the big one. So malaria is a protozoan parasite. It's not a bacteria or a virus or anything like that. Giardia is a common intestinal one, and Trichomonas is a common sexually transmitted protozoan infection. All right. Algae is another type of eukaryotic microorganism. So algae also belong in that kingdom Protista. These guys are plant-like protists. So these are capable of photosynthesis, which means they can generate their own glucose. They can generate their own food using sunlight. Algae are not pathogenic, so you can't get an infectious disease from algae. So we're not going to be talking about them too much here, except to note that they are considered microorganisms. All right, now on to the fungi. So fungi are also eukaryotic, so within the domain Eukarya, but the kingdom is fungi here. There are two major types of fungus. We can have molds and yeasts. So yeasts are definitely single-celled. So that's what we have in this picture on the left-hand side of your screen are tiny little single-celled yeast. Molds, this is a microscopic image of mold spores over here on the right side of your screen. Um, some molds are pathogenic. Again, molds are going to be everywhere. Yeasts are going to be everywhere. We find these microbes all over the place. They like it better if it's dark, if it's damp. You find more of them growing. A lot of them do cause allergies, and then yes, some can be infectious. All right. And then our last category, well, not our last category, but our biggest category, meaning the largest organisms we're going to be talking about in this class are the helminths. So helminths are worms. These are eukaryotic. So they are in the domain Eukarya. They belong in the kingdom Animalia. So they're actual animals. Um, Many of them are not even microscopic. So many helminthic infections are caused by worms that are large enough to be seen with the naked eye and in fact are quite large in some cases. But we do consider them in microbiology because in a lot of cases they drop eggs that are microscopic, and that's the infectious form of the parasite. So what you're looking at here in these pictures, the picture on the right, picture A there, is a tapeworm. So really, really long tapeworm that was taken from someone's intestine. The picture on I'm sorry, did I say left or right? I forget. The picture on the right, this one here, This one is Dracunculus medinensis. So Dracunculus medinensis is a roundworm that actually lives underneath the skin and will start to burrow out of the skin when the skin contacts water. So that's what's happening in this picture here is the worm is burrowing out of the skin and someone is twisting it around a stick to remove that worm from the person's skin. All right. Next category is viruses. So viruses are capable of infecting all living cells. So um, animals get viruses, plants get viruses, fungi get viruses, even bacteria get infected with viruses. So they can infect everything. They're considered parasitic. Um, a lot of times we just refer to them as protein-coded genetic elements because these guys are not cellular. So you notice before we were talking about the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, these guys don't have cells. So they're missing most of the major cellular elements. They do have genes. There is some genetic material surrounded by protein, but that's about it. Viruses are completely dependent on the host, right? They cannot reproduce on their own. And because they're completely dependent on the host, they tend to intertwine themselves with the host's genetic material. And because they get into our genes, they can affect the evolution of pretty much everything on the planet, from microbes all the way to humans. All right, a few quick questions before we wrap up here. So, what is the science of taxonomy? How many domains of life exist in the current system? And name the 5 categories of microorganisms. So I'll give you a moment to think. All right, so here are your answers. Taxonomy is the science concerned with the classification of organisms, so just how we classify things. In the current system, the Woese Fox system, there are 3 domains. Those are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And the 5 major categories of microbes are bacteria, viruses, protists, fungi, and helminths. All right, so I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions.